Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks. I'm Alex, and I'm here to talk about structured code generation. And you might have seen me already in LLVM conference or other conferences talking about some of the similar subjects, including structured code generation, maybe Linalg transform data, and so on. And in addition to that, like saying, are you redoing the same talk every LLVM conference? You might think, well, I already heard about this thing, but I don't really understand what it is. It's kind of too complicated. It comes from these weird people doing research of fine polyhedral stuff, needs to understand math. It's not yet ready to be used. It's like experiment and so on. So I'm going to make an argument that many of you might already be using concepts from structured code generation. You just don't necessarily realize that you do. And yeah, I should mention it's a joint work with Nicola Vasilak and many other people who contributed to pieces of MLIR that I thought I should just mention. So let's deconstruct this talk, and we have structured code generation, so let's talk about structure first. And let's start at the very, very bottom. I think we all understand if you have two floating point scalars, we can add them together. It's an operation. It's kind of simple. You just add two numbers. Well, it's floating point, so it's not that simple, but it's simple enough. We all understand it well. And we can write pseudocode for that. Like, you have A and B that are scalars. You have C that equals A plus B. We have an instruction in, I think, all ISAs I'm aware of that have an add instruction, at least those that have floating point. And obviously enough, we have an MLIR operation for adding floating points. And in case you haven't noticed, the talk is about MLIR, even if it's not in the title. And that's kind of simple. We add two numbers. There's not much structure here yet. What we often do, though, is we don't only add a pair of numbers, we add pairs of lists of numbers element-wise. And that, it's also kind of simple enough. We know vectorization, so we can add a vector of 4, 8, 16, whatever is your size, floating point numbers to another vector of 8, for example, floating point numbers. It starts getting more complicated in pseudocode because you need subscripting. You can represent it as a loop. You still have a vector instruction on many ISAs, not of them, but like on x86, you have instruction for that. And well enough, in MLIR, you can use the same arithmetic add operation to add vectors as used for scalars. But what we see here is there's some structure appearing. We started with a simple addition of two elements, and now we kind of extended it element-wise to operate on a vector or a list of things. And this works quite well. We can extend it further and say, well, why only 1D vectors? Let's have 2D vectors. Let's have matrices. And let's add things element-wise. Well, it remains reasonably simple. The pseudocode still uses subscript notation. You can still express it as a loop nest now. The assembly on most ISAs starts getting kind of long, so you either have an actual loop with control flow, or in my case, I tried enrolling that, and I have like 32 instructions. Here they're all the same, just adding all the rows I have in my vectors. Well, in MLIR, it's kind of nice because we can still use a arith_add instruction now on a 2D vector, because MLIR just happens to have a 2D and ND vector. And well, if you have a more exotic, well, it's not that exotic anymore. If you have a more advanced architecture like Google Cloud TPU or even NVIDIA GPU, you might have a 2D instruction. So you might be able to add 2D vectors as an instruction that you're targeting. Well, it's all right, but we can go further. We can say add 3D, 4D, 7D, however many dimensions you want. We can add that. And what's good about MLIR, it will let you keep using the same instruction. So we have this element-wise extension of most scalar operations we can think of. And many of the MLIR operations are designed to kind of transparently expand to this element-wise application, which gives us the first kind of structure we have, and we all use. Like if we use vectorized code in LLVM, we also use that. So we have this uniform repetition as a kind of structure that we observed. Well, element-wise is kind of simple and not interesting. Sometimes we want to do something more than that. So sometimes we want to add the same value to every element in a vector. And well, that thing is called a broadcast. It does exist in many instruction sets. It also exists in MLIR as a vector.broadcast. It's all nice and simple, and we have a simple loop and a subscript notation if we want. It similarly extends itself to a 2D case, so if you want to add a 1D vector to a 2D matrix, we can. We can do a broadcast of 1D vector, and then we can just add two 2D vectors. Interestingly enough, on x86 it doesn't need broadcast anymore in the instruction. You kind of repeat the addition of this line to each line in the matrix, and it all kind of works. Until it doesn't. Because I said, well, we are going to add 1D vector to a 2D vector, but I never specified how to interpret that 1D. Is it a row vector or a column vector? And at that point, it starts breaking down, and we now need the broadcast in assembly back again. We actually need many broadcasts, and we need a transpose and MLIR. And that is kind of unfortunate because, well, for 2D case, I only have 2 options. And then for the ND case, I will have like an exponential number of options. How should I interpret my smaller dimensionality vector tensor for a larger, like along which of the dimensions I want to broadcast? And we started thinking in MLIR, we kind of want to preserve that nice way of representing the thing using one or a couple of instructions that are simple enough. How do we represent all of this? And we looked at the loop level pseudocode that we have here. And if I remove all the fluff, what we have here is we have a loop nest with iterators I, j, k, whatever, we all know loops. And we have subscripts. And those subscripts capture enough information to understand when we are trying to broadcast something or when we are trying to permute something. So in this code, we can see that in the 1D case, we have I as loop iterator, and we're accessing both things with I. And in the row broadcast case, we're accessing the 1D vector with I, and in the column, we're accessing it with j. You know, it sounds like a basic loop level transformation class from university, definitely had that. And this representation we actually have almost directly in MLIR as a concept called affine map. Details do not really matter if you don't know what affine is. It's basically a linear function or like a multi-dimensional linear function. What really matters is it's exactly that representation. It's exactly something that captures these broadcasts and permutations that we want to capture, and we can have it directly in the IR. We could, for example, have this broadcasting element-wise operation that does the element-wise extension plus broadcast that I mentioned. Unfortunately, we do not have that specific operation on vectors. We probably should, but we are kind of lazy, so we didn't implement that. The point here is there is another kind of structure that we can observe is when element-wise is not enough, one of the first things we want to do is we want to do a sort of dimensionality increase. So we want to take a smaller dimensional object and turn it into a larger dimensional object by replicating parts of it. Well, there's also the inverse problem of that. Sometimes we want to decrease the dimensionality, which is typically done by reducing something. And in 1D, fair enough, we can just add adjacent elements and keep adding until we get to a scalar. So if you have a vector of 8 elements, we need like 3 additions and generally like log 2 additions. And fair enough, there are some instructions that lets us do that. And there is an MLIR operation that specifically does a reduction of a vector. And this thing also works on a 2D representation, well, kind of. We need to repeat this vector reduce on every element on the dimensions we do not reduce, and it starts getting more and more annoying. So we can try and reuse that affine map representation, that subscript indexing representation that we introduced before for broadcasting, but for reduction instead. So we can say, instead of saying we are broadcasting along the dimension I, we are saying dimension I will disappear. It was present in the result, it will disappear. It means we need to reduce it. And at some point, we also need to say, how do we combine these values? So we need to say that my reduction kind here on the slide is an add. And that, it kind of gives a complementary structure. So we started with an element-wise extension of scalar operations, and we added a way to adjust dimensionality when it doesn't match. So we can adjust it by expanding it by broadcasting, or we can reduce it by contracting this in a reduction. Let's make a quick detour. So far, we've been only looking at essentially computational space, or what our iteration looks like if we talk about loops. Well, something similar can be done in memory. So if you think about memory, well, you can go and read an element from memory. It's going to be like 8 bytes or something. It's not actually what happens when you read from memory. It's more complicated than that, and usually read some sort of bigger chunk of data like a cache line. And oftentimes you might want to use it to do it more efficiently, to read the entire vector from memory. So in this case, when we read a row vector, that's kind of nice. We can do, well, if it's aligned, it's very nice. If it's not aligned, tough luck, it might be not as efficient, but we still can read the entire vector in like 2 round trips to memory. And again, fair enough, we have an unaligned and aligned and unaligned read as an assembly instruction on x86, for example. We actually have several ways of representing that in MLIR. I'm not very happy about that, but we do. So we have like a memory float and vector load. And just out of curiosity, how many people know what a memref is in MLIR? Some, okay, so I have an extra slide for those who don't. A memref, it's an abbreviation for a memory reference. It's a terrible misnomer. What it is, it's a sort of 2D, not like ND tensor, where you can specify how many elements from the initial one you need to jump over to get to the next element along a dimension. So for the fastest variant dimension, it will be 1. And fastest variant dimension is not necessarily the last one or the first one. It can be in the middle. It's also not necessarily 1. It can be 2 or 5. It can be strided. So it gives you this multidimensional lattice of elements that you can reason about, because it remains a rectangular, hyperrectangular lattice. And that's a quite powerful abstraction we can use for transformations. So we can actually leverage that when we want to read something like a column vector. So when we have a column vector, well, we can use a gather instruction. It's not super efficient, but at least it's one instruction. In MLIR, we have an equivalent that's called transfer read, but it's not an arbitrary gather. We're not gathering a random pointer plus another random pointer plus another random pointer. We're gathering addresses that are offset by a fixed factor. And when reading one column, it's not exactly important. But if you're reading columns in a loop, that starts getting interesting for transformations. Because when we look at this, we see that, well, in fact, we are going to read 4 columns. And these columns are just next to each other. So instead of doing multiple gathers, we can transpose this axis and we can read rows instead, that being more efficient, and then do transpose in registers. So that is what this structured representation with structured memory, with this lattice representation, plus this structured representation of control flow allows. So our third kind of structure we observe is, well, the way we reason about memory is actually multidimensional. The way memory works may not be, but we really want to preserve that multidimensional thing so we can reason and transform about memory accesses. So let's recap. We have an element-wise extension of ND vectors. We can adjust dimensionality mismatch, and we observe that there is similar structure in memory accesses. And if you think about many machine learning frameworks, a lot of those have like high-level operations like matrix multiplication. Many of those can be expressed using this kind of abstraction. So given this relatively simple example, so we have 2 loads and broadcast, and then we do an add and a multiply and store results back. So we add 2 things and we do max with 0. So we kind of keep only positive results. We keep repeating this 4×8 element-wise extension for all the operations. We don't really want to do that. It's like as if you were repeating the same loop over and over again instead of just writing one simple loop that goes over multiple times. And this brings us to the infamous Linalg generic instruction, which is the prime example of structured op, but it's not the only structured op out there. The concept is not specific to Linalg. It's not even specific to MLIR. It exists elsewhere. What we do here is we reify the structure that we had. We reify this iteration space of 4 by 8 in my example, or just an iteration space, put that in the surrounding op, and express everything inside as an operation on elements. So in this example, it's kind of mouthful to explain, but really quick, we have this data access. It's structured with affine maps. So we see from the two iteration dimensions I and j, we are accessing either I and j when it's element-wise or an empty list when it's a scalar, and scalar does not have indices. We define what the iteration space is, and it's implicit here. The iteration space is derived from the size of objects we're operating on. So in this case, it's a 4 by 8 memory reference. And we also say we can iterate in parallel. It's up to us to prove it's not. And finally, we do all the computation on individual elements. Now, if we want to do something more interesting with this, we can say we can operate on a subset. So instead of operating on the entire matrix, we can say we iterate on one element of a matrix. So we give an offset along each dimension, and we can give sizes and strides. It's called a subview in MLIR, but it's just really like accessing an element. And the last structure we might want to think about is what we get in SSA or functional programming. And I suppose most people here are familiar with LLVM IR, and LLVM has structs and vectors and has insert element instruction. And unlike many programming languages, where you kind of go and override something, here what happens is you insert an element into a structure and you get a new structure. So the structure is immutable, but you can also extract that. And this is similar if you want to express computations on higher dimensional objects, for example, tensors. And tensor is MLIR is basically the same as a memref in terms of notation, but it is not associated with memory. It's just an object. We have not decided where exactly it lives, but we can access it using the same multidimensional lattice. And since it's an object that does not live in memory, it doesn't really make sense to overwrite it. So what we do is we create new tensors by inserting things in them, and we can also slice tensors and get a smaller tensor out of that. So instead of accessing elements of a memory, we can now extract elements from a tensor, get a smaller tensor, and operate on that. You can ask why these immutable sliceable objects are useful to us. And they are useful to us to actually do code generation, which is the second part of the title. And if we start with this generic representation, we ultimately need to execute this. So we need to generate some code. And if we start with the iteration space, well, it just naturally maps to loops. We know these are parallel for all loops. We can have this extract slice actually extract one single element. We can say the result needs to be inserted in the resulting tensor as one element, and we just copy over the body. And now we have loops, and we kind of know how to lower loops. Clang does that, Flunk does that, Swift does that. It's like nothing magic. What's more interesting here, if we wanted to instead operate on a 2 by 2 subtensor, this is equivalent to loop tiling. And loop tiling is a very powerful transformation that people have wrote books about. And that's really important to get any sort of performance on both ML and HPC. And we get loop tiling for almost free by basically saying instead of operating on one element, we are going to operate on a subset of elements. And the subset doesn't even need to be contiguous. In my case, it is, but it doesn't have to be. Moreover, we can do more advanced transformations like producer-consumer fusion. In this case, when we're getting a subset of a tensor, we can go and look at whoever produced that tensor and take the iteration space producing the tensor and just merge it into the iteration space we have here. I have this cocky slide saying code generation is a choice, but it's actually a lot of choices. And what we can do here is when we are doing code generation, we can decide that we're going to generate loops that iterate over one element, many elements. When we do many, we say how many, we say how do we select them. So we have many of these choices, and they're kind of recursive. So when we do this, when we generate one loop, we can preserve the structured operation that we had before, and we can keep decomposing it. And that's the kind of main structure I wanted to extract here. In this case, we can search through these transformations and find what works best for our case. So we can do tile and fuse, and then express that as yet another thing expressed in the transform dialect. I'm not going to talk about it. I had a talk last time. Please watch it if you want. So to summarize, structured code generation is based on observation about pre-existing structure in the IR, such as uniform repetition, dimensionality adjustment, multidimensional memory, and immutability. We just generalized it to higher level objects like tensors that we see in ML compilers, but otherwise it's nothing magic. Many of you are already using this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alex. Questions, please.
You called it a fine map. That suggests to me that you can also do 2i plus j in the mapping. Is that correct?
In theory, yes, but it's mostly not supported.
Okay.
But the idea is it's not even limited to affine maps. It needs to be some sort of representation that is invertible. If you want to do fusion. If you don't, it doesn't have to be.
Thank you, Alex, for your talk.
Thank you.